The silence was the first thing that hit me. It wasn't just quiet. It was a deep, profound absence of noise that felt like a physical presence. For 5 years, I had lived in a third-floor walk-up in the city where the official soundtrack was a 24/7 remix of sirens, arguing neighbors, and the bass line from the bar downstairs that vibrated through my floorboards like a constant, low-grade earthquake. My home studio was a converted closet where I had to time my audio recordings between ambulance runs and the hourly eruption of domestic bliss from apartment 3B. But here, in my very own house in the heart of Chestnut Meadows Estates, the silence was so pure you could almost hear your own hair growing. I stood in the middle of my new living room, a space so vast I could do a full cartwheel without hitting a wall, and I just listened. Nothing. Not a peep. A bird chirped somewhere outside, a sound so foreign and gentle it was practically exotic. "This is it, Jack," I said aloud, my voice sounding strange and loud in the stillness. "You've made it. The promised land." The house was perfect. A little cookie-cutter for my taste, sure, but it had a 2-car garage, a room that would become my state-of-the-art sound design studio, and a backyard with a single, lonely-looking oak tree. The lawn was a mystery, a green expanse I was supposed to do things to. Mow it, I guessed. Maybe water it. I'd figure it out. For now, I was just basking in the glow of homeownership, feeling smug and successful. I had escaped the urban chaos. I was a grown-up. My blissful ignorance lasted approximately 48 hours. The inciting incident wasn't a loud party or a boundary dispute. It was far, far pettier than that. I came out to my car on Tuesday morning, ready for a triumphant trip to the hardware store for things I didn't know I needed, and found a piece of laminated plastic tucked under my windshield wiper. It wasn't a flyer. It was an official-looking card, with a clip art image of a chestnut leaf in the corner. In a crisp, judgmental font, it read, "Homeowners Association Violation Notice. Violation #74B. Improperly stored refuse receptacles. Your refuse and/or recycling receptacles were observed to be visible from the street at 11:47 a.m. on this day. As per Covenant 12, Section 4, all receptacles must be removed from the curb and stored out of public view no later than 9 a.m. on the day of collection. A grace period of 2 hours has been exceeded. This serves as your first and only warning. Cordially, Carol Peterson, President, Chestnut Meadows HOA." I blinked. I read it again. "Refuse receptacles. My garbage can." I had taken the bins out for the first time, proud of myself for remembering it was trash day, and then I'd gotten lost in setting up my mixing board. It was now almost noon. My bright green recycling bin was, indeed, sitting at the end of my driveway, a flagrant monument to my tardiness. My first reaction wasn't anger. It was pure, unadulterated bewilderment. Someone, a person, had taken the time to notice my garbage can, check the time, consult a rule book, type up this notice, laminate it, and then walk over to my car to deliver it. The sheer dedication to pettiness was almost impressive. I chuckled, tossed the card onto the passenger seat, and decided to just be more careful. It was a weird quirk of the neighborhood, that's all. I was watering my one sad-looking hydrangea the next afternoon when I had my first face-to-face encounter with the architect of my violation. A woman who looked to be in her early 60s, with a helmet of perfectly coiffed blonde hair and a pastel pink tracksuit, came power-walking down the sidewalk. She was holding the leash of a small, fluffy white dog that had the face of a perpetually startled Victorian ghost. "Hello there," she called out, her voice a little too bright. "You must be the new owner of the Miller place." "That's me, Jack Riley," I said, offering a neighborly smile and turning off the hose. "Carol Peterson," she announced, extending a hand. Her grip was surprisingly firm. "I'm the HOA president. I live just 2 doors down. We're so glad to have you." The little dog yapped, a sound like a squeaky toy being murdered. "Hush now, Prince Bingley," she cooed. "Nice to meet you," I said. "And Prince Bingley, of course." "I trust you got my little note," she asked, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Just a friendly reminder. We all have to do our part to maintain the community standards. Aesthetics are everything, you know. A visible trash can. Well, it's a slippery slope. Before you know it, people are parking on their lawns, and the property values plummet." "Right," I said, my own smile becoming a little strained. "Wouldn't want to trigger a housing market collapse over a rogue recycling bin. My bad." Her eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second before the sunny disposition snapped back into place. "Exactly. I knew you'd understand." Her gaze then drifted from my face down to the garden hose, coiled haphazardly on the grass. "You'll want to make sure that's coiled to a diameter of no more than 18 inches when not in use. It's in the bylaws. Keeps things looking tidy." Her eyes then flicked to my front porch, and I saw them land on my welcome mat. It was a gift from my sister. A glorious novelty item that said, "Welcome to the Jungle," in a font reminiscent of a certain 80s rock band. "And that mat," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "While charmingly rustic, is not on the pre-approved list of welcome greetings. We have a catalog if you'd like to see the acceptable options, mostly floral motifs and simple welcome scripts." I stood there, hose in hand, as she and Prince Bingley continued their patrol. I was no longer bewildered. I was beginning to understand. I hadn't moved to a peaceful suburb. I had moved into a miniature totalitarian state, and I had just met its supreme leader. A week later, an email announced the monthly HOA meeting to be held in Carol's garage. Attendance was strongly encouraged. My curiosity got the better of my desire to stay home and watch paint dry. So I went. Her garage was cleaner than my kitchen. The concrete floor was painted with a gray epoxy, and the walls were lined with immaculate shelving units where every tool hung on its designated hook. About 15 of my neighbors sat in folding chairs, sipping lukewarm lemonade from paper cups. The meeting was a masterclass in bureaucratic absurdity. A 20-minute debate erupted over whether desert sand or Tuscan beige was a more appropriate shade for repainting the mailbox posts. A motion was passed to formally censure the Henderson family for their unauthorized wind chimes. I was slipping into a coma when Carol cleared her throat and said, "Now, for our final item of new business." A hush fell over the garage. "As you all know, our community is committed to fiscal responsibility and environmental stewardship," she began, a benevolent smile plastered on her face. "After a thorough review of our monthly expenditures, I've identified an area where we can make a significant saving, while also enhancing the natural nocturnal ambience of our beautiful neighborhood." She paused for dramatic effect. "Effective next Monday, we will be deactivating the 2 streetlights located on our cul-de-sac." I physically sat up straighter. I looked around. A few people frowned, but no one spoke. This couldn't be serious. "Hold on," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. "You're just turning them off? The streetlights?" Carol's gaze settled on me. It was the look a biologist gives a new and slightly disappointing specimen. "Yes, Mr. Riley. That is the proposal." "Why?" I asked. "What about, safety? Seeing where you're walking? Not having your car broken into?" "The ambient light from our homes is more than sufficient for navigation," she said, her tone crisp and rehearsed. "And frankly, the harsh, unnatural glare of those sodium lamps disrupts the migratory patterns of our local finch population. We must think of the ecosystem." A meek-looking man in the front row, whose name I later learned was David, dared to speak up. "My wife, She sometimes gets home late from her nursing shift." Carol's smile was positively pitying. "A personal flashlight is a wonderful and responsible tool, David. And think of the savings. A grand total of $14 a month for the association." $14. She was plunging the entire street into medieval darkness to save $14 and protect the sleep schedule of some finches. I wanted to argue, to scream about how insane this was, but I could see it was a done deal. The other residents were either too intimidated or too apathetic to challenge her. She called for a vote. Her hand shot up. No one else moved. "The motion passes unanimously," she declared with triumph. I walked home in a daze, the lukewarm lemonade souring in my stomach. I had been defeated by the most ludicrous, petty, and idiotic piece of bureaucracy I had ever encountered. I stood on my perfectly manicured lawn, looked up at the friendly orange glow of the streetlight at the corner, and felt a sense of impending doom. The war hadn't just been declared. The first shot had been fired, and it was aimed directly at the light. The following Monday, at precisely 10 p.m., the world outside my window ceased to exist. One moment, the friendly sodium vapor glow was casting long, familiar shadows across my lawn. The next, a pair of metallic clunks echoed down the street, and the world was swallowed by a thick, oppressive blackness. It wasn't just dark. It was a professionally curated, artisan-level darkness. A city dweller like me wasn't used to this. In my old apartment, dark meant the ambient glow of a million windows, streetlights, and neon signs, a perpetual twilight. This was different. This was a deep, inky, bottom-of-a-well blackness that felt like it had weight. My first practical test of the new regime came an hour later. I'd forgotten to take the trash out, the correctly stored trash, mind you, for the morning pickup. Armed with a new sense of by-law-abiding diligence, I grabbed the bin and wheeled it toward the curb. Or where I thought the curb was. I misjudged the distance by about 6 inches, and my foot went down into nothing. I stumbled, pinwheeling my arms like a cartoon character, and only barely avoided face-planting in my own prize-winning hydrangea. The bin tipped, spilling a bag of coffee grounds and eggshells onto the driveway. As I was on my hands and knees, cursing Carol Peterson and her finch-loving soul, I heard a clatter from down the street. It was followed by the distinct sound of a raccoon cackling in triumph. He had, with absolute impunity, knocked over the Henderson's bin and was now feasting on last night's lasagna. The darkness wasn't creating a natural nocturnal ambience. It was creating a paradise for petty criminals and vermin. This wasn't just an inconvenience anymore. This was a public safety hazard. I retreated inside, my righteous indignation simmering. I sat in my living room, the only light coming from my laptop screen, and stewed. I was trapped. What could I do? Write a strongly worded letter? Start a petition? That would just get bogged down in the same bureaucratic molasses that created the problem. Carol held all the cards. She was the system. And then I saw it. A salvation. A large contractor's truck, probably leaving a late job, turned onto the main road at the end of our cul-de-sac. Its roof was adorned with a rack of powerful work lights, and for a glorious 30 seconds, the driver switched them on to navigate the turn. A brilliant, clean, white light flooded the area, momentarily erasing the darkness. It was like a miniature sun had risen and set in under a minute. An idea, fully formed and beautiful in its malicious simplicity, bloomed in my mind. If the HOA wouldn't provide light for the public street, I would provide light for my private property. An abundance of light. A ludicrous, overwhelming, undeniable amount of light. My laptop was open on my lap. My fingers flew across the keyboard. My Google search history, which moments before had been a sad list of how to get coffee grounds out of concrete and local finch migratory patterns debunked, took a sharp, vengeful turn. Commercial stadium lighting for sale? Military-grade floodlights. How many lumens to simulate daylight? Brightest LED floodlight legal for residential use. I fell into a rabbit hole of pure, unadulterated vengeance. I learned about lumens and candela, about color temperature and beam angles. I read spec sheets and watched review videos. My inner monologue, once a stream of sarcastic complaints, transformed into a litany of technical specifications and gleeful calculations. 50,000 lumens? Cute. 100,000? Now we're talking. Could I power a 150,000 lumen fixture without blowing every fuse in a 3-block radius? The challenge was intoxicating. I felt alive. I felt purposeful. Carol wanted darkness? I was going to give her the face of the sun. By 3 a.m., I knew I couldn't do this alone. Mounting a few floodlights from Home Depot wasn't going to cut it. This project required a professional. It required a craftsman. It required someone who understood that sometimes a man's home is his castle, and sometimes that castle needs anti-aircraft searchlights. I found him on a local contractor's website. Sal's Electric, no job too big, no job too weird. The testimonials were glowing, mostly from people with complicated barn wiring and off-grid cabin setups. I called him first thing in the morning. A gruff, gravelly voice answered on the second ring. Sal's. Hi, my name is Jack Riley, I began, trying to sound like a normal, sane person. I'm looking to get a quote on installing some floodlights. Yeah, for a patio? A driveway? Easy job, he grunted. Sort of, I said, taking a breath. I want to illuminate my entire property. The front yard, the backyard, the side yards, and maybe a little of the street. I'm thinking something along the lines of what you'd see at a high school football field on a Friday night. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. I could hear him breathing. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head, weighing the potential profit against the undeniable insanity of the request. Finally, he spoke. You running a prison in your backyard, kid? No, I said. Just a very, very secure residential property. HOA issues. That was the magic phrase. I heard him chuckle, a low rumble like rocks in a tumbler. Say no more. I'll be there in an hour. Sal was a caricature of a contractor, in the best possible way. He was built like a refrigerator, with a thick gray mustache and hands that looked like they could crush bricks. He pulled up in a beat-up Ford F-150, took one look at my pleasant suburban house, and then looked at me with profound skepticism. All right, kid. Let's see the master plan, he said, folding his arms. I led him around the property, pointing out the strategic locations I had mapped out in my fever dream the night before. I showed him my hand-drawn schematics, complete with estimated beam angles and desired coverage areas. He listened patiently, stroking his mustache, his expression unreadable. Carol, as if summoned by a disturbance in the force, was conveniently weeding her petunias nearby, her eyes burning holes in the side of my head. So you want 4 main units, Sal summarized, pointing to the corners of my house. 1 here, 1 here, 1 here, and 1 here. You want 'em powerful enough to read a newspaper by from the other end of the street. Exactly, I said. I want it to look like daytime. At night. All the time. Sal looked over at Carol, who was now pretending to be fascinated by a dandelion. He looked back at me. A slow grin spread across his face. You do this, he said, his voice low. That lady with the poodle is going to have a conniption fit. That's not a bug, Sal, I replied, grinning back. That's a feature. He slapped me on the back, a gesture that nearly sent me into my own bushes. I like your style, kid, okay? I'll do it. He was won over, not just by the cash I was offering, but by the sheer, unmitigated audacity of the plan. He had a healthy, working-class disrespect for the kind of petty tyranny that measures hose coil diameters. He knew exactly the equipment for the job. Not some consumer-grade junk. He was talking about 4 military-grade LED floodlight arrays. Each one was capable of putting out 150,000 lumens of pure 5,000 K daylight white light. They were independently aimable and could be controlled wirelessly from an app on my phone. It was perfect. It was overkill. It was art. While Sal put the order in, I went to work on my legal defense. I knew Carol wouldn't take this lying down. She would come at me with the full force of the HOA covenant. So, I decided to weaponize it first. I spent an entire night with a pot of black coffee, a yellow highlighter, and the 350-page Chestnut Meadows Estates Homeowners Association covenant and bylaws. It was a document so dense and mind-numbing, it could be used as a general anesthetic. But deep within the legalese, I found my ammunition. I found the loopholes. First, Article 9. Section 2 forbade the erection of any permanent structures without prior approval from the Architectural Review Committee, which was, of course, just Carol. But Sal had already given me the solution. He would mount the lights on non-permanent, adjustable rigs that clamped onto the eaves of the house. Technically, they were temporary fixtures. Checkmate. Second, Article 14, Section 5 had excruciatingly specific rules about decorative lighting. Porch lights were not to exceed 800 lumens. Holiday lighting could only be displayed between December 1st and January 5th, but there was absolutely nothing, not a single word, about security or event lighting. And more importantly, there was no mention of a maximum total lumen output for a single property. A massive, gaping loophole. Finally, Article 14, Section 6 stated that all exterior lighting must be directed toward the owner's property so as to not create a nuisance for adjacent neighbors. This was the trickiest one, but I had a plan. I made a note to have Sal aim the beams with laser precision, ensuring the brightest part of the cone of light fell squarely within my property lines. Any spillover onto the street or Carol's prize-winning petunias would be purely incidental. I printed out the relevant sections. I highlighted them in bright, obnoxious yellow. I slipped them into a manila folder and labeled it in thick black marker, just in case. It was my shield. It was my sword. It was my Excalibur forged in the fires of bureaucratic nonsense. The parts were ordered. The plan was in place. The legal defense was prepared. All I had to do now was wait for the darkness to fall one last time. The day of the installation was a masterpiece of suburban passive aggression. Sal's truck, a rumbling beast of American steel, rolled onto our quiet little cul-de-sac at 8 a.m. sharp. It was followed by a white work van with 2 of his crew, a couple of young guys named Marco and Luis, who seemed to be enjoying the absurdity of the job immensely. The air was thick with tension. As they unloaded their gear, ladders, toolboxes, and 4 objects that looked like they belonged on the deck of an aircraft carrier, I could feel the eyes of the neighborhood on us. Curtains twitched. A few neighbors came out to get their mail, a full 3 hours earlier than usual. It was a quiet, polite, middle-class stakeout. And then there was Carol. She was a constant, hovering presence. First, she was out front, meticulously trimming her hedges with a pair of tiny scissors, her gaze flicking over to my house every few seconds. Then, she was in her front window, a shadowy silhouette behind the pristine lace. I knew she was taking notes, probably logging arrival times and taking photographic evidence with her phone. I decided to lean into it. I brought out a tray with a pitcher of iced coffee and a box of donuts for Sal and his crew, making a grand show of my hospitality. "Gotta keep the team energized," I said, loud enough for it to carry across the street. Sal grunted his approval, grabbing a Boston cream. "This is a high-performance job, kid. Requires high-performance fuel." As if on cue, Carol emerged from her house and began a slow, deliberate stroll towards my property line, Prince Bingley trotting nervously at her heels. She stopped at the invisible border between our lawns. "Doing a little electrical work, are we, Jack?" she asked, her voice dripping with forced sweetness. "Morning, Carol," I said, giving her my brightest, most innocent smile. "Just upgrading the old security system. You know, since it gets so pitch black out here now. Can't be too careful. Safety first." Her eyes narrowed. She knew I was up to something, but she couldn't prove it. The word security was my shield. How could she possibly argue against a homeowner taking prudent steps to secure his property? She gave a tight, thin-lipped nod and retreated back to her observation post. The installation itself was a work of art. Sal was a true professional. He and his team worked with quiet efficiency, running the heavy-duty wiring through the attic and down the walls. Then came the main event, mounting the lights. Each unit was a heavy, black, metallic beast, 1.5 feet wide. They mounted them on the special non-permanent rigs, clamping them securely to the eaves at the 4 corners of my house. The scale of the project was now terrifyingly, gloriously clear. These weren't just floodlights. These were instruments of psychological warfare. Sal spent the last hour on a ladder with a laser level, aiming each one with meticulous precision. He angled them downwards, so the epicenter of each beam would land squarely inside my property lines. The front 2 would turn my entire lawn into a verdant, hyper-real paradise. The back 2 would illuminate my sad oak tree and the fence line with the light of 1,000 suns. Any light that spilled onto the street or into Carol's bedroom window would be an unfortunate but legally defensible byproduct. By 4 p.m., they were done. Sal walked me through the control app on my phone. It was beautifully simple. A diagram of my house showed the 4 lights. I could turn them on and off individually or all at once. And right in the middle of the screen was a single, large, beautiful button. It was glowing red and labeled in all caps, "Solar Flare." "That's the panic button," Sal said with a wink. "Hits 'em all at once, full power, give it a try." "Oh, I will," I said, my voice full of reverence. "But not now. It has to be a surprise." That night felt like the longest of my life. I made dinner, I watched a movie, but I couldn't focus. My attention was entirely on the world outside my window. At 9:55 p.m., I went to my front window and looked out. The street was quiet, bathed in the last few minutes of its municipally funded glow. I saw a light go on in Carol's upstairs window. She was getting ready for bed, oblivious to the fact that her world was about to be turned upside down. At 10 p.m., on the dot, the familiar clunk-clunk of the streetlight relays echoed through the night. The darkness fell like a thick, woolen blanket. It was time. My heart was hammering against my ribs. My palms were sweating. I pulled out my phone and opened the stopwatch app. This had to be done right. I had to let them feel the darkness, let them get comfortable in it, let them stub their toes and curse the finches. I waited. 1 minute, 2 minutes. The silence was absolute. 3 minutes. I could hear my own breathing. At exactly 4 minutes, my thumb hovered over the solar flare button. My inner monologue was a frantic dialogue between reason and madness. Is this insane? Yes, completely and utterly. Is it necessary? Absolutely. It's for the greater good. You're about to declare war on a 60-year-old woman over a streetlight. She started it. I took a deep breath. I pressed the button. It wasn't a gradual brightening. There was no warm-up. It was instantaneous, biblical, and utterly magnificent. One moment my world was black. The next, it was bathed in 600,000 lumens of pure, unadulterated light. The effect was staggering. My slightly patchy front lawn was suddenly transformed into a landscape of impossible green. Every blade of grass rendered in hyper-realistic detail. The asphalt of the street, once a black void, was now a tapestry of gray, every crack and pebble visible. The neighbor's house across the way was lit up so brightly I could read the brand name on their grill cover. A confused owl, who had been enjoying the new, darker hunting grounds, let out an indignant hoot and flew away in a panic. My house was no longer a house. It was a beacon, a lighthouse on a suburban sea, a man-made sun that had just risen in the middle of the night. The silence that followed lasted for about 10 seconds. It was a stunned, disbelieving silence. Then the dogs started. First, Prince Bingley, a frantic, high-pitched yapping from Carol's house. Then another dog down the street, a deeper, more bewildered bark. Within 30 seconds, every dog in a 3-block radius was barking its head off. And then came the sound I had been waiting for. It wasn't a yell or a shout. It was a shriek, a raw, primal shriek of pure, unadulterated rage that cut through the night like a siren. It was Carol. My phone buzzed in my hand. The screen lit up with an unknown number. I knew who it was. I took a calming breath, put on my most cheerful, helpful voice, and answered. "Jack's residence, Jack speaking." The voice on the other end was a sputtering, incoherent ball of fury. What have you done?" "Carol, is that you?" I asked, feigning concern. "Is everything okay? You sound stressed. Did you happen to see my new security lights? Pretty effective, huh? I can see a raccoon trying to get into the Hendersons' trash all the way from here." "You are in violation of every rule in the book," she screeched, her voice cracking. "I am calling the police. I am calling the city. I am calling the governor." "Well, you be safe doing that," I said, my voice dripping with false sincerity. "It's awfully bright out there, but you still wouldn't want to trip in the dark." I hung up the phone. I looked out my window at the glorious, artificial daylight I had created. The war was over. I had just dropped the bomb. The police arrived in under 20 minutes, which, I have to say, is a pretty impressive response time for a complaint about a light. The cruiser rolled slowly down the cul-de-sac, its own red and blue flashing lights looking strangely dim and pathetic against the overwhelming brilliance of my property. 2 officers got out. One was young, with a face that was desperately trying to maintain a professional composure, but was clearly losing the battle against amusement. This was Officer Davis. The other was older, probably a decade from retirement, with a thick mustache and a deep, weary sigh that suggested he had seen every form of human stupidity imaginable. This was Sergeant Miller. I met them at my front door, which I had helpfully left open. "Evening, officers," I said, projecting an air of calm, responsible citizenry. Sergeant Miller shielded his eyes as he looked up at one of the floodlights. "Sir," he began, his voice flat and tired, "we got a call about a light." "Officers, I'm so glad you're here," I said, stepping aside to welcome them onto my porch. "I was just testing out my new security system. You can never be too careful these days, you know." Just then, the front door of Carol's house flew open. She stormed out onto her lawn, a vision in a pink silk bathrobe and fuzzy slippers. She was waving a sheaf of papers in her hand, which I recognized as a printout of the HOA covenant. Prince Bingley was yapping at her heels, a tiny, furry hype man for her rage. "That's him, officers! That's the man!" she yelled, pointing at me with a trembling finger. "He's creating a public nuisance. It's light trespassing. My civil rights are being violated. I can't sleep." "Would you like to come inside?" I asked the officers, completely ignoring her. "I can offer you a soda. I was just about to show you the relevant city ordinances." To their credit, they followed me in, leaving Carol to rant on her lawn. Sergeant Miller took a seat at my dining room table while Officer Davis stood by the door, his eyes darting around my living room, a grin threatening to break free. I calmly retrieved my just-in-case folder from the counter. "As you can see here," I said, laying out the highlighted pages, Article 14 of the HOA bylaws has no restrictions on total lumen output for security lighting. And this, I added, sliding another paper across the table, is City Ordinance 1138C regarding residential lighting. As you'll note, there is no municipal cap on lumens for private property, as long as the primary illumination is directed onto the owner's land. Sergeant Miller picked up the papers. He read them slowly, his mustache twitching. He looked from the papers to me, then out the window at my miniature son, then back to the papers. He let out that long, weary sigh again. It was the sigh of a man who just wanted to finish his shift and go home. He stood up and walked to the door. "I'll go talk to her," he said. We watched from my doorway as the sergeant patiently tried to explain the situation to a sputtering Carol. We couldn't hear everything, but we got the gist. "So, not breaking any city laws, ma'am?" "This appears to be a civil matter. An internal HOA dispute." Carol was not having it. "It's a menace!" she shrieked, her voice carrying across the unnaturally bright lawn. "My petunias are wilting from the constant daylight. I can't sleep." This was my moment. I leaned out my door, cupped my hand to my mouth, and called out in my most helpful tone, "Have you considered blackout curtains, Carol? I hear they're on sale this week at the Bed Bath & Beyond." Officer Davis choked back a laugh, disguising it as a cough. Sergeant Miller shot me a look that was equal parts annoyance and grudging respect. He said a few more words to Carol, turned, and walked back to the cruiser. The police had officially declared themselves neutral. It was a massive victory. They told us to sort it out like adults, and drove away, leaving me and Carol in a silent, brilliantly lit standoff. The next morning, a formal, typed letter appeared in my mailbox. It was a request for a special emergency mediation session to be held at my convenience. The letter was signed by Carol, but the tone was completely different. The arrogance was gone. It was the letter of a defeated general requesting terms of surrender. I had won. I granted her an audience that evening. The negotiation took place on my front porch, under the glorious, unwavering gaze of two of my 150,000 lumen sentinels. I had them on, of course, for ambience. Carol sat in one of my patio chairs, looking tired and small. Her helmet of hair seemed to have deflated. Prince Bingley sat in her lap, shivering, either from fear or the sheer overwhelming brightness. Her authority, once absolute in this tiny kingdom, was shattered. She had flown too close to my son, and her waxy wings of petty tyranny had melted. "Fine," she said without preamble. "What do you want?" I leaned back in my chair, steepling my fingers. I was tempted to draw it out, to ask for 1,000 small concessions. But I knew what I wanted. I wanted peace. I wanted the status quo. "It's simple, Carol," I said, my voice calm and even. "The streetlights go back on. Not just for a week or a month, permanently. You will call the city tomorrow morning and have them reactivated. The motion to deactivate them is repealed, effective immediately, and recorded in the HOA minutes." She stared at me. This was her great project, her monument to fiscal responsibility and Finch protection. Undoing it was a total humiliation. "And you'll turn those things off?" she asked, gesturing vaguely at the floodlight that was currently making her squint. "I will turn them off," I confirmed. "The moment the streetlights are confirmed to be back online, but," I added, letting the word hang in the air, "they stay up. The lights stay exactly where they are. They are my security system, and they will serve as a reminder." a reminder of our mutual commitment to community safety and the importance of adequate lighting for all residents. A long silence passed. She knew what I was saying. The floodlights were my nuclear option, my deterrent. As long as they were there, she would never try a stunt like this again. "And one more thing," I said, a slow smile spreading across my face. "I want the Welcome to the Jungle mat officially approved by the Architectural Review Committee. I want it in writing." She looked at me, a flicker of her old fire in her eyes, but it died just as quickly. She was beaten. "Fine," she whispered. She agreed to all my terms. A week later, life in Chestnut Meadows Estates had returned to normal. Or rather, a new normal. The streetlights were back on, casting their familiar, gentle orange glow across the cul-de-sac. My floodlights were dark, 4 silent, sleeping giants on the corners of my house, a constant, unspoken threat. My Welcome to the Jungle mat was now a legally sanctioned piece of decor. The balance of power had shifted. The neighbors were friendlier. David, the man with the wife on the nursing shift, gave me a subtle thumbs up when he saw me getting my mail. I had become, it seemed, a reluctant hero of the common resident. That Friday, I got a call from Sal. "Heard you won the war, kid," he said, his voice rumbling with amusement. "Good on ya. Hey, listen to this. I got a call from some guy on the next street over. His HOA is trying to ban satellite dishes. He wants to know what kind of price I can give him on a 50-foot fully functional radio antenna." I laughed. "Tell him I've got a great lawyer." I hung up and went to my kitchen to pour a cup of coffee. I walked to my front window and looked out at my quiet, peaceful, and adequately lit street. I hadn't moved to the suburbs looking for a fight. I just wanted some peace and quiet to do my work. But I learned a valuable lesson that week. Sometimes, the only way to get peace is to show everyone you have a bigger stick. Or in my case, a brighter light. I took a sip of my coffee and looked down at my welcome mat with a deep sense of satisfaction. The jungle had been tamed, and I was its new, benevolent, and very well-lit king.